Margaret and Robert seemed like the picture of a steady marriage after 10 years together. But when Margaret uncovered her husband, his hidden secret that he was living a double life as a gay man, the shocking discovery ended in bloodshed and a crime that stunned their entire community. Margaret and Robert had built a life that, to anyone looking in from the outside, seemed steady and secure. They lived in a modest but comfortable house in a quiet Los Angeles suburb, surrounded by manicured lawns and neighbors who waved from their driveways. Both were in their 60s, well past the turbulence of youth, and their marriage appeared to be one of quiet companionship. They had celebrated 10 anniversaries together, each one marked by a dinner at their favorite restaurant, a glass of wine, and polite smiles for the photographs they framed on the mantelpiece. Their days were predictable, filled with the routines of aging comfortably. Margaret tended to her garden, cultivating roses and herbs with meticulous care, while Robert spent hours in his study reading books or scribbling notes in journals that rarely left his desk. Friends and neighbors often remarked on how stable they seemed. They did not argue in public. They attended community events together, and they hosted small gatherings during the holidays where Robert carved the turkey and Margaret handed out slices of pie. People saw them as an example of a couple who had survived the test of time, choosing companionship over drama, patience over passion. To many, theirs was the kind of marriage that younger couples aspired to, uncheckable and consistent. Yet Margaret felt the weight of something missing. She had grown accustomed to Robert's distance, the way he avoided physical closeness or brushed aside gestures of affection. She excused it as age or the natural decline of desire in long marriages, telling herself that love was not always about touch, but about loyalty and presence. Over the years, she had learned to silence the nagging questions. Why did Robert never look at her the way other husbands seemed to look at their wives? Why did he spend so many late nights in his study rather than beside her? Whenever doubt surfaced, she buried it beneath explanations that seemed reasonable. After all, he was a good provider. He never raised his voice, and he kept the household stable. Margaret convinced herself that stability was enough, even if she sometimes felt invisible in her own marriage. As their 10th anniversary approached, Margaret reflected on the decade they had spent together. She thought of the vacations they had taken to small coastal towns, the quiet evenings spent watching television, and the many birthdays marked with simple dinners. It was a life without chaos, but also without fire. She accepted it as her lot, telling herself that passion belonged to the young and that companionship was a blessing not everyone had. She chose gratitude over longing. Though her heart still ached for a closeness she pretended she did not need. What Margaret did not know was that beneath Robert's calm surface lay secrets he had carefully guarded for years. His private life, hidden behind the locked drawers of his study, was one she had never glimpsed. While Margaret believed their marriage was built on trust, Robert carried a truth that would eventually shatter the fragile foundation of their life together. The house that looked so stable from the outside was in fact standing on a fault line, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. The moment that unraveled Margaret's sense of stability came on a quiet afternoon when she decided to tidy Robert's study. The room was his sanctuary, a place she rarely entered except to dust or open the curtains. Robert often spent hours there, and she thought nothing of it, assuming his books and journals were harmless outlets for an aging man's solitude. That day, however, as she organized the papers scattered across his desk, she noticed the corner of a folder peeking out from beneath a stack of files. Something about its placement felt deliberate, as though it had been hidden rather than misplaced. Curiosity, sharpened by years of unanswered questions, pushed her to pull it free. Inside, Margaret found the fragments of a life she had never been allowed to see. There were photographs of Robert with men she did not recognize, moments captured with an intimacy that went far beyond friendship. Alongside them were printed emails and handwritten letters, some dating back many years. The words on the pages confirmed what the images suggested. Robert had been living in two worlds. One as her husband, the dependable man at her side, and another as a closeted gay man who had formed deep connections with others, while denying the truth within the walls of their home. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Margaret sat frozen in the study chair, the documents trembling in her hands. Every line she read dismantled the story she had built around their marriage. The late nights in his study, the lack of intimacy, The strange distance she had tried to excuse all of it suddenly made sense. For 10 years, she had convinced herself that stability was love, that loyalty was enough. But now she saw those justifications for what they were: illusions. The man she had trusted had woven a life of deception, binding her to a role in a story she had never agreed to play. The discovery unsettled her in ways she could not immediately process. Her first reaction was disbelief, a desperate attempt to explain the letters as misunderstandings, old friendships taken out of context. But the words on the pages left no room for denial. Phrases of longing, confessions of secrecy, and promises whispered to others carved into her mind. Each letter felt like a betrayal not just of her marriage, but of her dignity. As the hours passed, shock gave way to an ache that spread through her chest like fire. 10 years suddenly seemed wasted, built on a lie she had been too trusting to uncover sooner. She thought of the anniversaries they had celebrated, the quiet evenings she had cherished, and the moments when she had yearned for closeness that never came. Now those memories felt poisoned, their meaning rewritten by the truth she had uncovered. Margaret placed the folder back exactly where she had found it, her hands steady, despite the storm inside her. She did not confront Robert that night. Instead, she carried the secret in silence, her mind spiraling with thoughts she could not voice. Each glance at him now felt unbearable, as though she were looking at a stranger wearing the face of her husband. What she had discovered would not fade with time, it would grow heavier with every passing day, till silence itself became impossible. In the days after Margaret discovered the folder, her world turned into a blur of sleepless nights and restless thoughts. The image of the photographs and the words in the letters haunted her every moment. She could not look at Robert without feeling as though she were staring at a stranger who had played the role of her husband for 10 long years. The betrayal felt heavier than infidelity. It was the revelation that their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. Every act of kindness, every smile, every holiday together now seemed staged, a mask he had worn to hide the truth. Margaret carried this knowledge in silence, but the weight of it began to change her in ways that others quickly noticed. She became irritable, snapping at neighbors who made casual comments, withdrawing from community activities she had once enjoyed, and leaving conversations unfinished with old friends. At home, she oscillated between icy detachment and simmering anger. Robert remained oblivious, moving through his routines as though nothing had changed. His evenings were still spent in the study, his mornings in the garden, his tone calm and untroubled. The normalcy of his behavior only deepened Margaret's rage. She watched him prepare coffee, mow the lawn, and read his newspapers. And all she could see was a man capable of lying so thoroughly that even she, the woman closest to him, had never suspected the truth. At night, Margaret lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced. She thought about the years she had given him, the sacrifices she had made, and the loneliness she had endured. The realization that he had been sharing his affection with others while leaving her with scraps of companionship was unbearable. She began replaying every moment of their marriage, searching for signs she had missed, convincing herself that she had been foolish to trust so blindly. Each memory became tainted. Anniversaries now felt like performances, vacations like distractions, and every moment of intimacy a cruel act of pretense. The silence of her suffering soon turned into physical tension. She moved through the house with sharp movements, slamming doors or clattering dishes louder than necessary. Her hands trembled when she held a cup of tea, and her eyes grew shadowed with fatigue. Neighbors whispered that Margaret seemed unwell, perhaps overwhelmed by stress or health issues, but no one knew the storm that raged inside her. She avoided confiding in anyone, unwilling to expose the humiliation she felt. To admit what she had discovered would be to admit that her life had been nothing more than a hollow performance. Robert, wrapped in his own world, gave her no reason to believe he had noticed her change. His detachment, once something she explained away as age, now felt like proof of his secret life. Each evening he disappeared into the study only confirmed her worst fears. Margaret began to feel trapped, her home no longer a place of comfort, but a prison of deceit. The more she tried to suppress her emotions, the more they festered. Anger grew sharper, betrayal deeper, and loneliness unbearable. Within her mind, resentment became a constant companion, whispering that something had to give, that silence could not last forever. and that the truth she had uncovered demanded a price to be paid. Margaret's breaking point arrived gradually, like water eroding stone, until the dam within her finally cracked. She had spent weeks in silence, circling through denial, anger, and despair. But the bitterness only grew heavier with every day that passed. By the fourth week after her discovery, the rage that had been simmering beneath the surface had turned into something darker, more consuming. Margaret no longer saw Robert as her husband of 10 years, but as the architect of her humiliation, the man who had stolen a decade of her life while hiding behind lies. The marriage vows she once cherished now echoed in her head as cruel jokes, hollow promises, mocked by the reality she had uncovered. Her mind began replaying the betrayal over and over, each cycle feeding her fury. She thought about the years of loneliness, the cold distance in their bed, the quiet dinners where conversation felt forced. She remembered how she had convinced herself that this was simply what marriage became with age, a steady companionship rather than passion. Now, all of it seemed like a disguise Robert had crafted to keep her from questioning the truth. Margaret's bitterness morphed into obsession. She began to watch him more closely, studying his movements, his expressions, even the way he looked at the men he passed in town. Every glance became proof, every smile confirmation of the life he had hidden from her. Her sleepless nights turned darker, spent hours pacing the house, staring into mirrors, whispering to herself that she had been made a fool. The idea that others might have known gnawed at her endlessly. What if neighbors had seen Robert's secret life and pitied her? What if his friends had shared laughs behind her back? The thought of becoming an object of ridicule in her community was unbearable. Margaret's pride, once her shield, now became the very fuel for her unraveling.
Oh.
She began to believe that her suffering demanded retribution. It was during one of those long, restless nights that the seed of violence took root. In the kitchen, she opened a drawer to fetch a glass, and her eyes lingered on the gleam of a knife. The thought startled her at first, as though it had sprung from someone else's mind. But instead of rejecting it, she let it sit there, deepening each time she imagined Robert's calm face as though nothing was wrong. The knife represented control, a way to reclaim the power she felt had been stolen from her. Slowly, her anger crystallized into a plan, though she told herself it wasn't one. It was just a possibility, an image that gave her a strange sense of calm when the nights grew unbearable. Margaret began moving through her days with a strange clarity, though beneath it was a storm of intent. She prepared meals, cleaned the house, and kept up appearances, but inside she was rehearsing. Each small act of routine life became a mask to cover the darkness rising within her. When Robert sat quietly in his chair reading, she no longer saw her husband, she saw the man who had ruined her. The man who owed her a debt that could only be repaid in blood. The line between thought and action grew thinner, and Margaret crossed it in her mind long before her hands ever did. By the time the moment arrived, the idea of violence no longer frightened her. It felt inevitable, as though fate itself had been leading her to it all along. The night Margaret acted was eerily ordinary, the kind of evening that should have passed quietly like countless others before it. Robert had finished his supper, taken his usual seat in the living room, and opened the same worn novel he had been reading for weeks. The house was silent except for the hum of the clock on the mantel and the faint rustle of pages turning. For Margaret, the ordinary details of that night only heightened the weight of what she had resolved to do. She had played her role as she always did, serving dinner without complaint, clearing the dishes, moving about the house with a calmness that belied the storm within her. But beneath that facade, her mind was locked on a single, unshakable thought. This would be the night the lies ended. As Robert sat engrossed in his book, Margaret moved quietly into the kitchen. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer and wrapped her fingers around the handle of the knife she had stared at so many times before. The blade felt heavy, colder than she expected, but it also filled her with a strange sense of purpose. For weeks, she had been powerless, trapped in the prison of betrayal. But now, with this weapon in her hand, she felt control slipping back to her. She paused, staring at her reflection in the darkened kitchen window. The woman who looked back was unrecognizable, hollow-eyed, hardened, consumed by rage. Margaret stepped back into the living room, her movements deliberate and silent. The air seemed to thicken with every step, the second stretching into an eternity. Robert did not look up immediately, absorbed in the pages before him, oblivious to the storm descending upon him. When he finally raised his eyes, it was too late. Margaret's fury, years in the making, had erupted into action. She struck with the knife, her anger guiding her hand with a force she could no longer restrain. The sound of his gasp cut through the silence of the house, followed by chaos that unraveled in an instant. The attack was frenzied, each motion fueled by betrayal, humiliation, and rage. Margaret did not stop to think, nor did she allow herself to feel the gravity of what she was doing. In those moments, her pain found release through violence, a release that had been building for 10 long years. When Robert finally collapsed, the book slipping from his hands to the floor, the house fell silent once again. The only sound left was Margaret's ragged breathing and the steady ticking of the clock, as if time itself bore witness to the irreversible act. In the aftermath, Margaret stood motionless, staring down at what she had done. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor, but the weight in her chest did not lift. She had thought that this act would free her from the torment of betrayal, yet as she looked at Robert's still form, she felt only emptiness. The years of anger and humiliation had culminated in a single night, and now there was nothing left but silence. The house, once filled with secrets, now echoed with the finality of violence. Margaret realized too late that she had not reclaimed her life, she had destroyed it. The truth she had uncovered had taken everything, and in the end, it had consumed them both. The aftermath of Robert's death unfolded with a grim inevitability, each hour pulling Margaret deeper into the consequences of her actions. At first she moved through the house in a daze, unable to comprehend what she had done. The knife lay abandoned on the floor, its surface glinting faintly under the lamp, while Robert's body remained slumped in the chair, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The silence of the house was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint drip of blood staining the rug beneath him. Margaret sat across from him for what felt like hours, her hands clenched together, waiting for some wave of relief that never came. She had believed that taking his life would free her from the cage of betrayal, but the emptiness she felt was far heavier than the rage that had driven her. As the hours slipped by, Margaret's mind raced between panic and numbness. She considered calling the authorities, confessing everything, and ending the torment immediately. But fear rooted her in place. She imagined the humiliation of neighbors whispering, the headlines that would reduce her to a caricature of rage, the courtroom where every detail of Robert's secret life and her reaction to it would be dissected. She was no longer just a betrayed wife. She was now a murderer, and the community that once respected her would never look at her with the same eyes again. Shame and fear built around her like walls, trapping her as effectively as her husband's lies once had. By morning, the weight of reality had grown unbearable. Margaret attempted to clean the scene, wiping surfaces, moving objects, trying to erase the traces of what she had done. Yet no matter how much she tried, the sight of Robert's body remained, an unmovable reminder that her life had crossed a line it could never return from. With each effort, the futility of her actions grew clearer. She could scrub the floor, discard the knife, close the curtains, but she could not undo what had happened. The evidence of her crime was not just in the room, it was etched into her very soul. When the authorities eventually arrived, it was not because Margaret had confessed, but because silence had drawn suspicion. A neighbor, concerned by the absence of Robert in his usual morning routine, came to check in and stumbled upon the horror inside. The police were called, and within moments, Margaret's carefully constructed mask of composure shattered. Officers found her sitting motionless at the kitchen table, her eyes vacant, as though the woman she had been no longer existed. She did not resist when she was led away, nor did she protest when questioned. Her words were fragmented, heavy with exhaustion, the story spilling out in pieces shaped by anger and grief. The community reeled in shock as the story spread. For years, Margaret and Robert had been seen as a steady couple, a symbol of endurance in a world where marriages often crumbled. Now their names were tied to tragedy, whispered with disbelief and judgment. Margaret's trial became a spectacle, her husband's secret life exposed alongside her violent response. Some pitied her, others condemned her, but all agreed that the story was both haunting and tragic. In the end, Margaret's act had not only destroyed Robert but had consumed her as well. leaving nothing behind but a chilling reminder of how betrayal and rage can twist love into something unrecognizable.